Okay. Welcome to the Post-Traumatic Enlightenment Summit, an interview series to help you move past trauma, learn to redefine yourself, and build an inspiring life. I'm your host, Jennifer Cunningham. One of the ideas behind this series is to highlight a broader range, array of programs, courses, books, podcasts, and people that will help you or someone that you love who has experienced trauma to move on and grow from the experience. Our guest today is Dr. JamieMarich, a counselor, trauma specialist, expressive arts therapist, EMDR trainer, and dancing mindfulness creator. One of the things I love about Dr. Marich is her energy and her creativity in dealing in this whole topic. So welcome, and I'm happy to have you here.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Good. So just to start, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into this field, a little bit about your background, and how you came to be this expert?
Yeah, so I got into this field by a fusion of two things. First of all, my own recovery, and I guess you might call it an accident or a happy series of events. When I was an undergraduate, I hated psychology. I took one course in psychology. It just didn't appeal to me. So if you would have told me at age 18, 19, I'd have been a professional counselor and teaching, I would have laughed. So yeah, a couple things happened. My undergraduate degree is in history, English. I have a lot of pop culture specialties. I have a background as a performer. And after I finished my undergraduate, I was in a pretty bad place with my own addiction and mental health symptoms. Plus, I didn't know what I wanted to really do with my life. So I moved to Bosnia, the Croatian part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. My family's Croatian, so it wasn't a totally random move, and I had spent some time studying in the country. And this was a few years after the Yugoslav Civil War in the early 90s, and there was a lot of need for English teachers and English language assistants. And so that was the main reason I went there. And I initially started working for a primarily Catholic organization, and then by the end of my time there, I worked for a couple other different groups doing language work. I had the privilege of teaching English at a children's home, which is really how I got my trauma education. I was mentored by a very wise American social worker who helped me to understand what trauma really meant and how unhealed trauma from deplorable social situations in the country, the fallout from the war, the fallout from communism, just really got in the way of basic human functions like motivation, concentration, and a lot of spiritual solutions were being given in this context in which I worked, but it always felt like something was a little missing. And this mentor was just absolutely perfect, not only in helping me to understand the impact of trauma on my students, but then she did a lot of, because she had created that good relationship with me, I felt comfortable asking her questions about my own recovery that needed to be addressed. And so I've been clean and sober since I lived there. It was July of 2002. I got clean and sober. I also started looking at some of my own mental health issues around trauma, and that work has continued on myself since I came back to the United States. But yeah, the long story short of it is towards the end of my time there, both she and a priest who I worked for said, "Why don't you go back to graduate school for counseling?" Again, my response was, I didn't like psychology, so I don't know how this is going to work. So from remotely, when I was still living there, I took some of the prerequisite courses I needed. And I found I did really like it because I not only had that relevant experience of my own recovery, but working as an educator in that climate just made me very interested in it. And I had some challenges when I came to the U.S. and did my graduate degree. My first internship was very overwhelming for me, but it was that experience that got me into further trauma-based counseling, which really, I received it for myself in that period, and it really defines so much of the crux of my work now. So yeah, that's the long and short of it.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So, one of the things that you've talked about in some of the things that I've seen either on your website or on other podcasts and whatnot, is this talk about fear. So we know fear is a universal emotion, but people who have experienced trauma often have heightened sensitivities and fears after having gone through an experience. So in your TEDx talk, you talk about a little girl named Anita who you met who taught you something about fear. And I love that story, so I was hoping you could share that.
Yeah, and it's a good time to ask because I just talked about this children's home that I worked at, and yeah, she was a student, and I've since tried to find her online unsuccessfully through some
Mm.
other contacts that I have with people I still know there, because I think this little 4-year-old girl was one of my greatest spiritual teachers ever.
Wow.
And that was her pursuit of learning how to swing by herself on a swing set. And the children's home where I worked at had a really lovely swing set, and every day she would watch with fascination as the older kids would go on the swing, and she would go on like my lap or another adult's lap, but she really wanted to try doing it herself. And she was very tentative at first. And day by day, I would swing her a little bit, and then she'd be like, oh, that's enough for today. And then one day she got really eager and enthusiastic about it and said, higher, higher, higher. And I kept pushing her higher, higher, higher. And then she fell off the swing.
Oh.
And so, of course, my initial intent, response was, oh gosh, she's not ever going to want to go to the swing again. I'm the most horrible caretaker that I pushed her too far. And so she did cry. And she let me hug her while she cried. She wasn't hurt in any way. And then she said, all right, let's do it again.
Wow.
And she got right back up on the swing. And the still thing, it was like, no, push me higher, higher, higher. And then at a certain point, when she was like at the maximum height she felt she could reach, she just yelled out, I'm not afraid anymore.
Oh.
I'm not afraid anymore.
Wow.
And I mean, I had such chills. I almost cry. I think I did cry at the moment. And I still get chills every time I tell the story, because it was such an important lesson to me about healing and recovery. I mean, I know for me in my journey, fear is inevitable, even if trauma wasn't part of my story, part of my equation. Fear is a part of life. And even when people talk to me about challenges, especially with anxiety, my inevitable question is, what are you afraid of? Right. And I don't judge you for being afraid, because we have tons of fears that drive us. Fear of failure, fear of insecurity, fear of not being good enough, fear of the unknown, whatever it may be. And so I know faith has been a big part of what has helped me to overcome fear, whether it's faith in my higher power, my spiritual practice, or faith in myself. Sometimes it's very much a combination of both. And what Anita really showed me that day was a determination that really did show me a lot of faith in herself. Faith in the process, I think, is another way that we can practice faith. And I really came to believe from that experience that faith, I know we use that kind of saying, get back up on the horse, but for me, it's always been get back up on the swing.
Right.
from that experience. And it's the story's been a big part of my formation. And many years later, 2014, 2015, I had the opportunity to learn aerial yoga.
Oh yeah.
Is hanging literally from like a sheet that's mounted well to the ceiling. And it has a lot of that element of learning how to swing and learning how to trust the process, trust yourself, trust that the swing is holding you up, trust in your breath. And when I learned aerial, it brought up every fear and insecurity about my body, about my abilities, the process, but it really did tap me back into that experience with Anita. And when I fell, I mean, obviously checked in to see if I needed care.
Yeah.
But then usually the answer was, get back up on the swing.
Nice. So it's funny you just talked about that aerial yoga, because really that's about tapping into mindfulness, right? And really trusting your body, understanding where you're at, and really understanding your breath. Listening, you talk about listening to the beat of your heart to inform you. So how does that work with trauma victims or people who are experiencing anxiety or any kind of emotional upheaval? How do you tap into mindfulness and use it as a tool?
So my working definition of mindfulness that I like the best, because there's a lot of translations and scholars and writers who share their definitions, is it's the art and the practice of coming back to the present moment. Because I think so many people will do a Google search on mindfulness and see this perfect person sitting on a beach as the waves go by with look of absolute calm on their face. And I'm like, absolutely not. Most days I have this frustrated look on my face when I'm meditating, and it takes a while to get to that place of calm. And I think the key to any mindfulness practice, whether you're doing it with sitting meditation and more movement-based meditation like walking or dancing, which I think are all wonderful ways to practice mindfulness and meditation, that your attention will drift. You will drift from the present moment. You'll either be pulled to the past, to the future, to your obsessions, to your lists, whatever it may be. But the point is you can always come back. And that is the practice. I think that's where we learn and that's where we grow. Tell my students, my clients, even if your head wanders 10 times in a minute, the key is noticing it when it wanders away and bring it back. And it is a very slow, gentle, yet challenging way for trauma survivors to learn how to recalibrate their brain and their responses. One of the ways that trauma is described is it makes our brains more reactive. And the practice of mindfulness can teach us how to be more responsive.
Oh, and that's interesting.
A very simple way that plays out in my life. So I can be a very reactive email responder or texter responder. And if I get some kind of business email that annoys me in any way, my first sense can still be to go from that place of reaction and write an 8-page response and just get all testy. And I have found even taking a couple hours to step back and breathe, noticing without judgment what that email may be bringing up in me, because I think that's another big part of mindfulness we overlook when we think of it just as a relaxation technique, that mindfulness is about training yourself to be present with whatever comes.
Right.
And it could be something like fear, annoyance, sadness. But many mindfulness teachers have used this metaphor of it's like riding a wave.
Yeah.
Feelings like waves will come and go. Some will feel bigger than others. Some will feel like they will engulf you. And Jon Kabat-Zinn, the great mindfulness teacher, has always said that mindfulness practice is not about making the waves stop. It's about learning how to surf. And I just think that's a fabulous skill for trauma survivors to have as part of their recovery. It's something that can be challenging in the early stages, but I think if the clinician is willing to work with them, there's always a modification with skills. So if people feel they can't sit for the timer that's on the meditation app for like 10, 15 minutes, I'll say, can you do it for a minute? Let's start small, or maybe find a pathway for practicing mindfulness that may resonate. And then if you can learn to do that in the early stages of your recovery, when some of the time comes for the deep digging with some of the emotions and feeling maybe what you have stuffed for a lot of the years, having that skill of being able to be with whatever comes without judgment will inevitably serve you when you go in to do that deeper work.
Right. Yeah, that's good. So it's a muscle you're kind of learning to use, right?
Training ground. Yeah.
So you mentioned dancing as a mindfulness practice, and you've created this whole program. And that's actually what initially drew me to you. I think it's so fascinating. Can you talk about dancing mindfulness, how you created it, what kind of impact it's having on people's lives?
Well, I have danced my whole life since I think I came out of the womb dancing. I had a student who's a painter recently say, I think I came out of the womb with a paintbrush. And I said, I believe I came out of the womb dancing to ABBA, because my mother lessons when she was pregnant with me, and I still get all happy whenever I hear ABBA. So yeah, dance my whole life, especially growing up with some quite a bit of stress and issues in my home. It was always something that I could turn on music and just do. And I think for many years I would have explained my home dancing in my house as like I would put on big concerts just for myself in my dance down in the basement. And I would often say that it helped me to escape reality, but looking back at it now, it helped me to better deal with the reality that I was being dealt. And to me, that's so much of what distinguishes dancing mindfulness from some of the other dance programs and conscious dance forms, that it's not really about going to ecstatic or altered states. It's really about being able to dance with whatever the moment brings you. Dance, even if you're feeling insecurity sensitivities in your body to be able to dance with those. And it's really the way we practice that surfboard metaphor of riding the waves, using dance and stillness to help us ride the waves. Because even in a typical dancing mindfulness class, we will start in stillness, we will end in stillness. People have the option to take a still pose at any time. And a line I use a lot in our classes is, when you take those still pauses, notice how the stillness is experienced, how it resonates in your body after the movement. So as part of my counseling repertoire, I'm a big believer that even though I offer trainings and teach trainings, I like to at least take a good training for myself every to be that student and learn something new. Back circa 2011, I became acquainted with the Kripalu Yoga School in Massachusetts, and I went there for a weekend retreat, and I found this noon conscious dance that they do, and I started taking some classes there, and I took a training there in another form that ultimately was not a good fit for the work I do. And a lot of it is what I explained, that for me, it's not really about like ecstatic dance or going to some kind of altered state, but it's really about being more in the moment. And a lot of these mindfulness skills that I had been teaching anyway as part of my clinical repertoire just felt really easy to teach through dance and through other expressive arts. So I really cultivated for many months what I feel was a lot of my own personal practice. I was going through a horrible breakup at the time. And it's interesting because I recently had a conversation with this individual who was saying things like, I feel so bad for everything that I put you through during that. And I'm like, that's nice to hear the apology. I said, but on the other hand, there's like hundreds of people throughout the world now that are part of our community who would probably thank you for that.
Yeah.
It's just, it was something that really helped me to ride the wave of that heartbreak and not judge myself. And it has turned into what started as a class. I started it as a class at my local yoga school I was working with. I also took it as a class to a lot of counseling conferences that I attended. And my main reason for doing it there was, let's explore what it's like, because mindfulness is a huge buzzword in counseling. It has been now for many, many years. And my thought was, let's explore what it's like to practice mindfulness in an even more embodied way. And my other reason for that is counseling conferences, and I think conferences throughout are known for, let's sit on our butts and watch PowerPoints all day. And when if we do something a little more experiential. So from a lot of those conference experiences came a request, will you do a training in this? And so I put together a training, and the key has always been of our trainings in it that you can use it in your existing practice. So if you're a yoga teacher, a classroom teacher, a counselor, there's not ever a pressure to go out and teach classes in dancing mindfulness, but you can use a lot of the attitudes and the elements that we emphasize. And it's really turned into this beautiful, even in that first year and a half, people giving me feedback about how it impacted just areas of their daily life. And I was reminded of how I had built my personal practice from working with that stress and heartbreak of transition. And so then the book came about in 2015. And the challenge that I was given when I got the book contract was, can you teach people who may never be able to access a class?
Right.
How to develop and cultivate a personal practice with dancing mindfulness. So that even writing the book ushered in yet another new dimension of it for me. And I'll share with you a story that I think is very telling to what I mean by this. So one of my psychologist colleagues, who would describe himself as a pretty straight-laced male, I had no idea was paying attention to my Facebook posts about dance and dancing mindfulness and videos. And so one day I randomly got a message from him, and he said, I just want to let you know that seeing all of you and your people's enthusiasm about dance has caused me to dance every morning in my kitchen.
Wow, that's awesome.
I just put on some of my favorite music and I dance around the kitchen, and dancing is always a good idea. And when he shared that, it was just such a sense of, yes, this is what it's about, is using this concept of mindful dance in our daily lives. It's not necessarily just about a class or a therapeutic technique, although it certainly can be used as a mindfulness-informed intervention. So it's just my great joy. I mean, there are other things I do as part of my training career and counseling career, obviously, yet anytime I get to do a dancing mindfulness workshop, retreat, Anytime I get to weave it into a counseling session, it just makes me smile.
That's great. I mean, I'm thinking back to the beginning of our conversation about fear, because I think you might, or maybe you find that in every group there's somebody who resists doing this dancing mindfulness, right? Because it's vulnerable. And also I think with fear, and if you've experienced trauma, there is this sort of holding yourself together for so long that it just feels so vulnerable to release, and you're exposing yourself in front of other people. So how do you deal with that, or how do you address that aspect of it to get people to kind of loosen up? And
Yeah. Well, one of the things we work with in our facilitators is accepting that that's an inevitability, that in every class you'll have somebody who has that fear, that trepidation about going there. And I think it goes both ways, because some people have a fear of sitting with emotion and sitting with breath. And so where it's easy to get in there and dance, the challenge for them really becomes doing the relaxation parts or the rest parts. So it can go both ways. But a lot of the vulnerabilities we have seen around expression in dance is a fear of the body, of course, because so many people have been plagued by shaming messages about the body, whether that comes from old toxic religious stuff, whether it comes from body shaming about size, about ability. Something I hear a lot from people when they know that I do dance and I may be working dance into some of my workshops, people will say, well, I dance in front of my dog or the grandkids, but I don't think I could dance in front of other people. And something I always ask them is, what is it about the dog and the grandkids? And the answer, especially with the dog, is they're not going to judge me.
Right.
And the answer with the grandkids is they're not going to judge me. And that sense of play is so natural and inherent to them. It's somewhere along the way we developed this internal metric that I think society pounds into us that says you have to do it well.
Right.
In order to do it. So in our opening statement, we address a lot of this. A lot of it is we normalize the vulnerability. And even when we might transition to, because a lot of people handle the sitting part we do at the beginning, the stretch, and then when it's actually getting up to the feet and we promote more creative movement, because that's another challenge for people, that some of our folks who've come in will do well in a class like Zumba, where they are given specific steps on what to do. And there is a place in dancing mindfulness for giving some more directive facilitation and teaching if we feel a group needs it. But ultimately what we're going to do is show you a step and then encourage you to make it your own. Encourage the process to flow freely. And I've noticed for a lot of people, it's really the fear of creativity. That's
interesting.
So just is a huge block, because people will say, well, I can move if you tell me what to do.
Right.
But when you say just go with it and dance your heart, dance your story, let your breath guide you, that's when people tend to freeze up. So that's another thing we tend to acknowledge and normalize, that a lot of people just fear creativity, fear dancing or doing anything in a context where they're not told exactly what to do. Now, that's what a lot of us love about it. Like, I can't stand classes like Zumba at this point in my life. I mean, earlier points in my life, I obviously took structured dance and learned technique. But now it's like, I want the freedom. I want that ability to be creative and dance my own thing. And so for a lot of our folks, we're working around blocks of what is the fear about expressing your body's own inherent creativity, expressing moving how you want to. And then I still get a lot of, well, I could do that at home, not in front of people.
Right.
So I may say, well, start that then.
Right.
If that's where you can start, that's great. Yet the beauty of doing this in a group setting, and hopefully we can create and cultivate as non-judgmental of a place as possible, is that it gives you a place to work through some of those hangups and hopefully get supported in the whole experience.
And also, I guess, to realize that it's not about performance, it's about expression.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's another cool thing, that we've had a lot of trained dancers now who have come through the Dancing Mindfulness program to do the facilitator training or have taken classes. And they have shared a challenge for them has been to release a lot of that technique mind, performance mind, which they need obviously to work and be successful in their fields. But this is really helping them find a different side of dance. And yeah, even since our first facilitator training, every time we've had at least one professional dancer come through. And that's been really neat to see their relationship with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to pivot slightly and talk about your new book. So I haven't read the book yet, but I was reading online about it and kind of taking a look at it. So one of the things that caught my attention was that you have a chapter called Shifting from Trauma Informed to Trauma Focused. And I haven't heard that. So I wanted you just to explain what that was.
Certainly. Happy to talk about it. So trauma-informed care is one of those clinical buzzwords that has been lurking around now for about 5 to 10 years. And it's not a bad thing. I'm glad we're talking about it. I'm glad that there is a push there to make things more trauma-informed. And what that means is that as a human services professional, you are aware of what trauma is and how it impacts human behavior. And there's a commitment to do no harm, to not create further triggering and further traumatic reactions based on your knowledge about trauma. And the thing with trauma-informed care is anybody who works with the public could and should be trauma-informed. I tell people in many of my courses that your secretary, your receptionist, your clerk is the most powerful person in your building because they are the one who the client is having first contact with. Yeah. I have had horrible reactions in myself by how I've been treated by some medical office staff and some medical professionals. And so if you work in any field with the public, something I do now is education with yoga teachers, self-defense and fitness instructors now is an area I'm moving into, helping them become more trauma-informed, realizing that, yes, even dance teachers can be trauma-informed, knowing just how, like, if a student melts down in a class, it may not be about their performance, or it may not be about you. It may be about something that it's bringing up. So that's a lot of what trauma-informed means. There's been a big push for counselors, clinicians, social workers, psychologists to become more trauma-informed. One of the things we're arguing in the new book is that's a good start, but it's fundamentally not enough. And that's the shift to trauma-focused. And what trauma-focused care is truly realizing the impact of unhealed trauma on the presenting issues that come into our office and building our treatment plans accordingly. So it's going beyond a commitment to do no harm and not re-traumatize, and really actively look into what are your wounds here? What are your wounds that have been, because as you may know from my talks, trauma is a wound. That's really the simplest way to define it. It's an unhealed wound. Recognizing wounds can come in different shapes and sizes. And so being trauma focused is looking at not just a PTSD, but a variety of clinical diagnoses, or for individuals who've gone through an ordeal with a medical diagnosis and the fallout that creates. That being trauma focused recognizes how impacting that experience has been on the individual, and then developing a plan accordingly. And why that may seem like common sense to some of your listeners, but part of the context is that even in the clinical professions, there is still a bit of this old school thinking that, well, it's only really trauma if it's a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis.
Oh, interesting.
And the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, although it was a start when it was first introduced in 1980, is pretty rigidly defined, especially up until 2013. It had to be a life or injury-threatening event. There were a series of specific symptoms that had to be met for it to be post-traumatic stress disorder. And part of this old school thinking is still, well, that applies to veterans or people who've survived a natural disaster or a major accident, or if it was a sexual assault, there had to be some kind of life-threatening component. And it's not to say those things aren't trauma. I mean, they definitely are and could qualify for PTSD. But part of this broader definition of trauma that people like me and those in the EMDR field and those in other forms of trauma therapy are trying to look at are things like going through a divorce, having a child can be traumatic experiences, things that we may often just write off as stress, or like in the case of birth of a child, a happy event, but they can be wounding, especially if they're not healed or not addressed. Bullying is a big one that we look at. Going through care following a medical diagnosis, being the caretaker of someone as a major medical diagnosis. These are all legitimate forms of trauma, and they may not manifest as the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. They may show up as things like depression, anxiety, even obsessive compulsive disorder, adjustment disorder, what we used to call dysthymia, or now it's called persistent depressive disorder, which is kind of like the allergies of depression.
Okay.
Like the slow, low grade depression that just
Yeah.
doesn't really seem to go away. And there's just, even in other clinical diagnoses, substance use disorders, eating disorders, unhealed trauma can be a big part of those. And so much of this old thinking we've been trying to combat is when other professionals may say things like, well, let's deal with the primary thing first, like the anxiety, and then we'll work with the trauma or the PTSD, or let's get them sober first and then work with the trauma or the PTSD. And what we have found is that's just not good enough, because trauma is a part
Right.
of injury, is a part of why people are coming in or presenting. So trauma-focused care is really providing a climate where we're not afraid to talk about trauma. We're not afraid to go there. And people developing their treatment plans. So that's a little bit about the distinction. And thank you for asking the question. It's a great
question. No, I like that a lot. I like that a lot. And, one of the audience for this particular interview series is not, my particular lens of trauma is through cancer, but it really is about opening that discussion up and allowing people to identify and say, okay, that applies to my life because of my experience. So, I like that you're even saying that you want to expand that definition of trauma. So I think that's really great. It's really great. So, not everybody is going to be in counseling or feel that they need it at this particular time in their life. So what are 3 things that people can start to do to continue to move on from trauma, to kind of move towards a really positive growth period? What are some suggestions that you would have?
Well, I think developing some kind of daily practice, whatever that may be. We talked about mindfulness earlier on the interview, and there are so many ways that mindfulness can be practiced, whether it's doing a breath practice every morning, maybe a little bit of mindful yoga every morning, a mindful walk. While we were waiting here on the call, I was coloring. That's a way that I like to kind of center and ground in the morning sometimes. So something I advise my students and my clients both is pick a time period that you can commit to consistently. Not necessarily a time of day, although that can help. Like every morning I will spend 5 minutes doing this. But if you could commit to 5 minutes every day, I would rather see 5 minutes of consistent practice than do nothing for 6 days in a row and go to one really good trauma class or one really good yoga class or meditation class. So traumamadesimple.com is one of my resources sites I'd like to invite your listeners to.
Great.
I have all of my YouTube videos that are very for the public cataloged on there. Excellent. So variety of mindfulness strategies. We have about 24, 25 of them up there now. Mindfulness, mindful yoga, some mindful movement that people can play with. A second thing I would recommend is cultivate and really build your support system, no matter how that may look. I'm very blessed and fortunate to have no shortage of amazing friends who do not judge me based on what I'm feeling. And I just, that Beatles song, I Get By With a Little Help from My Friends, it's one of my anthems because I couldn't do without my support system. And I know, on the other hand, that is a vulnerability for many people, that there could be a hesitancy to reaching out, to getting close, especially if you've been burned in other relationships or other friendships. But even that practice of building a support system can be an endeavor, a practice in and of itself, because it's about learning how to trust your judgment, to know you don't have to give away all of yourself right away. Because I think that's when a lot of people do end up getting scarred by friendships or relationships. So, and there's a lot of ways that support can be built. I mean, in the recovery community, meetings, whether they be 12-step or other types of recovery meetings, have been a big part of how we have worked with and built support. Classes like dancing mindfulness, yoga, there's so many in the community that can be accessed. Maybe a way that you can build support. Going on a retreat might be a way, and not all retreats necessarily have to be the go away type. You might be surprised, like search in your local area, and a lot of yoga studios or like nearby retreat centers run like day retreats or commuter retreats. And then if doing a grief support group or a cancer support group, something that might be available to you in your community. I had the great privilege once of facilitating a dancing mindfulness class at a weekly cancer support group. And awesome. Not necessarily even to teach the dance, but just to see the sense of community that had built amongst the folks there. And it was great to then have them learn how to do a little bit of this dance together. And I think a third thing that I would recommend is, however this may show up for you, to not judge yourself for what you're feeling. The longer I do this work, I am convinced it is not our feelings that cause us problems. It's everything we do to keep from feeling our feelings that causes us problems. And that also can come from unhealed places of trauma. We may have been told things like don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, or implicitly kind of given those as rules in our homes growing up, or being told things like don't be weak, big boys, big girls don't cry. And we can get this message that feeling feelings is somehow bad or weak or will destroy us. Yet I really believe feeling the feelings is akin to riding that wave, learning how to swim in it. And the better you can develop a relationship with your feelings, not judging yourself for them. One of my favorites that I pass along is Rumi's The Guest House. It's a classic poem that is shared a lot in mindfulness retreats, mindfulness classics. It can be easily looked up online. And so much of what that poem endorses is welcome whatever comes. Like get passing through a house. They're not going to stay forever, but everyone has someone to teach. Every feeling has something to teach. So, and I know that's easier said than done. That may require professional help to be able to do that. But you may develop an expressive practice like drawing, journaling, painting. These things may help you really be with those feelings without judgment. So it's probably my third one that I would recommend.
Those are great. Thank you so much. That's awesome. What's your biggest joy in the work that you do? I think you've kind of talked about it all the way through, but what motivates you every day to stay in the work that you do?
Seeing that people are capable of learning new things in new ways. I see it with clients and I see it with students, which is even another special way it shows up in a lot of the trainings that I do. When I get feedback like this course and the way it was taught was a corrective experience for me and making me realize I can learn. That's a lot of what drives me and motivates me, because I've seen so many people who think they're incompetent or stupid because the way they've been taught is not adaptive and responsive to the way that they learn and see things in the world. So the interesting thing is I got into the counseling field through being an educator. And so it was not surprising to me that I found my way back to doing so much teaching as part of my counseling work. That's one of the reasons I pursued a PhD, and my intention was to teach university level, but I quickly learned that wasn't for me. But doing things like trainings, workshop retreats, working with adult learners in that way is just incredibly special for me. That drives me. And even counseling, I think, seeing the clients that I see is fundamentally a learning experience. It's realizing that we can unlearn and relearn then new things. And so I think it's a lot of that educator spirit that still drives me. And I just have to do it as part of what I feel is an extension of my mission here on this earth.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all your insight and for those tips. You do have a free gift for the audience, and I'm going to throw a link below the video. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
So it is the first introductory chapter of my book, Dancing Mindfulness, which came out in 2015. And we talked about it here on the interview. It's the kind of build a personal practice on dancing mindfulness. And you get a lot on what that can mean and look like for you just right there in that first chapter. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah, I will pass that along to your listeners with my compliments.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I encourage everybody to check out, to go to Jamie's website and to check out all of the resources. You have a ton of really great resources. So
thank you.
It's wonderful. So thank you very much for your time today. And thanks to everybody who's watching, because I hope that you have some takeaways that you can, that you learned today, and you can start with your mindfulness practice and start dancing.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.